Welcome up a tree. It has been quite some time since I last did an Old World army book review, so I felt it was high time that I turned over a new leaf, went out on a limb, and insert third tree-based pun here. Yes, I am up this tree because it is time to review the Wood Elf Arcane Journal. For those of you who haven't watched one of my army book review videos before, well, why not? What I generally do is compare the current edition of the rules, as featured in the Arcane Journal and Forces of Fantasy, or Ravening Hordes, whichever applies, against previous editions of the army books, generally the 4th, 5th edition book and the 6th/7th edition book. This is completed in a highly technical fashion, utilising a whiteboard, and it's currently sitting on that branch up there because it's fallen out of the tree once already, and I'm very glad that I haven't. Yes, this highly technical approach involves me scoring each of the army books out of 10 in the following categories. First of all, the units and rules that are presented in each book. Secondly, the amount of lore and the quality of the lore that is featured in each book. Thirdly, the magiciness. So this is magic items, it's really unique, flavourful special rules, and of course it's unique spell laws that feature in the army book. There is then usually a 4th wildcard category where I compare in the army book to some particular thing that captures the essence of that army book. In this case, I've gone with trees, and then I grade that out of 10, and then we total it up and see who wins. Some previous commentators on my videos have suggested that the modern Arcane Journal always wins, but that's not true. Watch some of the earlier videos and you will see that the older books do stand a chance. I'm going to put this briefly back up this branch and hope it doesn't fall out again. Don't fall out of the tree again. No, don't fall out of the tree again. I don't want to climb down again. It's a long way. Answer to why am I up a tree? Well, the original plan involved me launching into the Lumberjack song from Monty Python, but I couldn't find enough lumberjacks. So instead, it's me up a tree, because I felt that this is an army that I've never quite gotten on with. I've spent a lot of time being shot at by wood elves. Michael, I'm looking at you, also David, and your wood elves when we were a kid. But generally speaking, my only normal interaction with trees and so forth is chopping them down with a great big axe. What I'm trying to do therefore is to immerse myself in the setting and get a real sense of the flavour of the Arcane Journal, and not just because I thought this was a crazy idea and all the guys said do it and I'm susceptible to peer pressure. And I'm going to hold on to this whiteboard because it nearly went again. Let's turn first then to the Wood Elf army book, where it all began. This is the 4th/5th edition army book. It featured across both editions of the rules. It's got a wealth of background and lore that we'll go into shortly, but first and foremost, let's focus upon the rules and the unit entries that were made available. So, as with most of the 4th, 5th edition books, in terms of characters, it's fairly limited to a generic general, heroes, mages, battle standard bearer. There's nothing really to shout about in that regard. It does have a decent spread of units, and interestingly, it did allow you to take units of chariots, which I don't believe have featured in any Wood Elf army book since then. You had all the units that we'd come to expect, so archers, glade guard, glade riders, and Warhawk Riders, some of my favourite. The Warhawk Riders I maintain that featured in this book were by far better than any Warhawk miniatures they've released since. Other than that, you got the ubiquitous Treemen, you got Scouts, you got Dryads, you got Waywatchers, you got all kinds of cool and funky Elven units, albeit their style of play did mostly focus around shooting at your enemy. There was the combat options such as the War Dancers, which had some funky different war dances that they could use that gave them different abilities. So just as an example, find the War Dancers page. Where are you, War Dancers page? 4 different dances that featured in this book. The Whirling Death that increased their attacks, so it doubled their attacks. Woven Mist that distracted the enemy and forced them to take a leadership test or only hit on 6s. The Shadow's Coil that made it impossible for anyone to hit anyone. Or the Storm of Blades, which allowed them to strike all of their attacks against a single model, sniping out characters in combat, which is pretty cool. And I don't think any of the dances that have featured since then have been as cool. Waywatchers got the option to set all kinds of cool traps. It was very situational and depended upon your opponent being foolish enough to stray near to a wood whilst fighting a Wood Elf army, but there you go. And there was a host of unique special characters that featured in this book as well, but we'll touch on those in a minute in the lore section. In terms of scoring, I am going to give this book, and I'll just have to write the word lore back on where I've wiped it off with my arm. There we go. I'm going to give this book an 8 out of 10. Not as varied as some of the armies of Wood Elves that would come afterwards, but a decent grounding. And I think that's perhaps the defining feature here, is that this was a grounding in the Wood Elf units. Compare that then to the 6th edition book that then carried on into 7th edition as well. This one featured, well, first and foremost, it featured the 6th edition approach to army list building. So you had the core, rare, and special breakdown that we've come to see and use ever since. In terms of your characters, what was quite cool was it gave a much kind of wider spread of characters. So yes, you had highborns, but then you had the option to give them all kinds of different kindred rules to make them what flavour of highborn lord they were. Were they a Waywatcher lord? Were they a War Dancer lord? Which let you kind of add a focus and a narrative flavour to your army that is really quite cool. It had all the same units except chariots, again I'll note, that featured in the 5th edition book, but it also added another unit of cavalry, namely the Wild Riders of Kurnos and Treekin, kind of a mid-level unit between Dryads and Treemen that filled, I think, a very vital role in that kind of Wood Elf army. It gave you, whereas Dryads were a tough infantry unit, they perhaps lacked in some of the hitting power, but on the other hand, Treemen were easily outnumbered. Treekin filled that gap. For that purpose, I'm going to score this unit, this book, a 9 out of 10 in terms of rules and units that are available. Turning then to the Wood Elf Arcane Journal. Most of the army lists are actually still featured in the Forces of Fantasy book that was published alongside the main Arcane Old World rulebook at Old World release. It features basically everything that was kind of in the 6th, 7th edition book, and also the stuff that appeared in the 8th edition book. So you got the Sisters of Twilight, the kind of female version of the Riders of Kurnos that were added in at that stage. What we don't see, interestingly, is a return of the Kenothi, the ones that have since made the transition over into Age of Sigmar, the Kurnos Hunters, that originally were released as part of the End Times expansion. They were essentially like Treekin, but with weapons! And frankly, they looked a lot better than Treekin, and I can't see any reason why you wouldn't use those instead of Treekin models. I am a little disappointed that they didn't make an appearance in this. I know that they're now part of the Age of Sigmar range, but they were originally Old World models, and it's a shame that they didn't make the decision to keep them as part of the Old World list. What we do get, and it's fairly sparse on the ground, what you get in terms of units added to the the Wood Elves from the Arcane Journal. It's literally a character, a unit to go with a character, and some beasts. So there is a Warden of Talcin, which is essentially like a kind of a champion guard for the Queen's Court, and then the Guardians of Talcin, which is the unit that accompanies this kind of champion guard. They're basically like a slightly better version of Eternal Guard, which is kind of a slightly better version of Glade Guard, so go figure. The Beast Packs are a nice touch. I don't know that they necessarily fill a role that was needed in the Wood Elf book. Essentially, you've got the option to take hounds, cats, boars, and bears. It feels perhaps a little bit like just an excuse to drag out some of the classic models that were released yonks and yonks ago, like 4th edition level Wood Elves, I think maybe even 3rd edition Wood Elf rules. Yeah, you get to take kind of a mixed pack with some Beast Keepers, and then the Beast Keepers can keep up with them, and they're, to be honest, they're just slightly better kind of like cavalry. They don't get the benefit of like standard bearers and musicians and stuff that you'd get with Wild Riders. Aside from the models looking cool, I can't see a reason why you'd necessarily take a Beast Pack over, for example, just a unit of cavalry. For that reason, I'm giving this back down to an 8. Because we lose out on the chariots that we got in the 5th edition book, and we don't get any of the stuff that appeared later on in kind of the 6th, 7th edition era that appeared at the Old World, kind of End Times. So yeah, I'm going to drop that down to an 8. Let's look now at the lore for these books. Turning then back to our 4th edition, 5th edition book, there was a lot of lore in this. Like, this one is dripping in history. Pretty much, let me just kind of find where the army list starts. The army list is that much of the book, and bear in mind that a part of the back part is also the special characters which are dripping in lore. All the rest of this is lore and background for the Wood Elves. It's awesome. There's all kind of the story of how they came to get left behind when the High Elves left. There's the story about kind of all the different battles that they fought, how Orion and Ariel came to be central figures. And that's before I put it back in my bag, let's touch on the special characters. So in terms of the special characters that featured, there was of course Orion and Ariel, the king and queen of the woods. We also got Nyeth the prophetess, Falandor, who was kind of a great eagle riding lord. There was a battle standard bearer. There was Durthu, the greatest of all tree men, who did not make a reappearance in the Arcane Journal. What is up with that? There was Scarlock with his pet hawk. There was a wild dancer champion. There was Dryka, the dryad, who would make a central appearance in the 6th edition book, which we'll touch on in just a moment. And there was Score the falconer, which then in turn gave rise to kind of the whole separate Beastmaster section that's made its reappearance in the Arcane Journal. So for that reason, there's nothing I can do for the 4th, 5th edition book except give it a 10. It is stonking. Find a copy of this if you want to learn more about the lore of the Wood Elves. Let's turn to the 6th edition book. Sadly, like most of the 5th and 6th edition books, this one lost out on background. I mean, the bestiary section is got a little bit of information about it in each kind of the sections, but much of the rest of it is kind of just tucked away at the back. I think we get maybe 5 or 6 pages of Wood Elf lore tucked away at the rear of the book. It's a real shame, to be honest, and it's for that reason that I can only give it a 7 when it comes to lore. In terms of special characters, incidentally, the only special characters that, as again, happened most of the time in 6th edition, they toned down the amount of special characters that were available. Orion still made an appearance, and this is where the current Orion model arises from. They created a brand new sculpt of Orion for the release of the 6th edition book, which is lovely, and is available for sale now. Dryka also got upgraded rules and background in this matter, and then we got the Sisters of Twilight, twin wood elves, who ride around on the back of a forest dragon, which was one of the most awful models to put together ever. Let's touch on the Arcane Journal. This one actually, compared to some Arcane Journals, this one doesn't do too bad on lore. There's a decent amount at the front, which I think it does lift quite a bit from the 5th, 6th edition book, but then it also kind of updates you what's going on with the Wood Elves at this moment in time, and it focuses in particular on kind of the Wood Elf battles in Lorelorn, which was the Wood Elf forest, lesser known forest in the Empire, up in kind of the Northlands, where, funnily enough, Chaos are invading at the moment. So in that regard, it's quite cool. We get Scarlock returned in, albeit a slightly different format. They now call him Araloth, who actually I think did feature in the lore previously, but in all intents and purposes he's a repurposed Scarlock, complete with Pet Boyd. And Orion makes an appearance. Missed opportunity, I have to say here, for putting Durthu in here, missed opportunity not putting Dryka in here, given the Dryka model still exists, and a missed opportunity not giving us a new Ariel model. I do have high hopes, given that the Tomb Kings have gotten a second Arcane Journal and Cathay have gotten a second Arcane Journal. I do have high hopes that we might see Dryka, Durthu and Ariel making appearance in a second one of these in the future. But for now then, I am going to clock this in at an 8. It's better than the 6th edition book, but it's not saying much. Let's turn now to magic in the 4th and 5th edition book. Wood Elves did not get their own unique spell lore in this book. They basically got access to high magic or battle magic from the Warhammer magic supplement, which is fair enough. There was, I think, under Ariel, she did have not her own unique magic, but instead she had a whole host of different kind of spell items. So things like the Wand of Witch Elm and the Dart of Doom, which were kind of fashioned out of bits of the Oak of Ages and stuff. There wasn't a lot of uniquely Wood Elf magic items. I think some of them featured in the Warhammer magic book. They didn't, as far as I can recall, feature in this book. So we're talking about things like the Hail of Doom arrow and the Bow of Lauren, classic weapons that allowed for multiple shots for the Wood Elves. I'm going to give it a 7 for the 5th edition book, on the basis that it is somewhat limited in that regard. The 6th edition book did at least get its whole host of its own magic items in here, And, crucially, they did get their own spell lore, the lore of Athel Loren, which included things like tree singing, which allowed you to make woods zoom around the board like they were your own units, which is quite cool. The classic kind of magic items like I've just mentioned made a reappearance, so Hail of Doom Arrow. I think Arcane Bodkins is one of my favourite ones that made an appearance. This was essentially were magic arrows that ignored armour saves, which were great if you were fighting against like a Chaos Lord or something, I guess. I am going to give them a 9 for... I can draw a 9 now, upside down, for the amount of magic that's available to them, because I think that they do get a fairly decent kind of spread of stuff. Let's look at the Arcane Journal. So, again, there is, this time, its own unique spell lore. There is the lore of the wilds. There's no tree singing as such, but there is kind of a variety of spells that reflect moving through woods, like hidden paths or Durthu's Wrath, that allows you to kind of conjure up stuff, attacking things. There was, again, a bunch of magic items that featured in the Forces of Fantasy book, and these are kind of filled out by additional magic items that feature in the back of here. I'm going to give it another 8. I think an 8 is appropriate for the amount of magic that features across the different Wood Elf bits in this book. Let's look then in total at how do each of these match the vibe of the Wood Elves. So let's talk the 5th edition book first, the 4th or 5th edition book. They are still, to all intents and purposes, an elf army. I mean, they've got chariots, they've got cavalry, they've got spearmen. They are, in many respects, I suppose, high elves in kind of, you know, Renaissance gear. They're wearing cloaks and hoods and drinking mead. They are still recognisably Wood Elves. I mean, they've got the tree units that you don't get in the Wood Elf, in the High Elf army. They've not got access to kind of the heavy cavalry that High Elves do. So they are, in that respect, an elfish army, but they don't have the same connection to the land, I wouldn't say, that we would see featured in the later editions. For that reason, I'm going to compare them to the Beech Tree, which I'm going to say is the equivalent of an 8 out of 10. Let's look now at the 6th edition book. The 6th edition book was dripping with elven kind of specialities. I mean, all the different kindreds that were added in there to allow you to characterize your lords, the additions that kind of came along, like the Sisters of Twilight, the additions of Treekin. There is a lot to recommend, and the unique spell lore in particular is worth calling out because of the ability that it gave to make the scenery a part of your army. For that reason, I am going to compare it to the Mighty Oak Tree, which can only be considered, I think, a 10 out of 10. I would say lore-wise and generally appearance-wise, the 6th edition book is probably the most Wood Elfy of all the books. Let's look at the Old World in terms of how does that fit into the kind of character of a Wood Elf army. I mean, it's got almost everything that the 6th edition book has. It is still lacking perhaps a little bit, just in terms of there's so much more that they could have done with it and that they failed to do. And I think that's the disappointment that I have with it, is it does fall back still a little bit on, well, they're elves, they shoot things and they ride on animals and they've got beasts, and they don't need to put more thought into it than that. For that reason, I'm going to compare it to the Elm Tree, which I'm going to give a 9 out of 10. Let us then see the Varch, the Fir, the Mighty Scots Pine. None of those made an appearance. How do these score up then? Now, I've got to do maths upside down up a tree, so this is going to go well. 8 plus 7 is 15, plus 10 is 25, plus 8 is 33. 9 plus 9 is 18, plus 7 is 25, plus 10 is 35. How do I do a 5 upside down? Like that, I think. 8, 8, and 8, that's 24. 24 plus 9, ooh, 6, counting 3, it's another 33. So there you have it. The Old World book is an excellent book. I would say on a par with the 4th edition book, but it cannot match what was achieved with the revamp that Wood Elves were given when the 6th edition army book was released. That still stands, I think, as the benchmark for the reinvention of the Wood Elves. And on that bombshell, I'm going to end this video and get the heck out of this tree, because there is a bird that is looking at me funny. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I will be back on the ground, hopefully in the near future, to review the Beastmen Arcane Journal, so please come back for that. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Right. How the heck do I get out of this tree? just cut down, I guess. See you next time. Bye for now. I'm a lumberjack. I sleep all night and I work all day. Cut down trees.